I always dreamed of living in a small, tight-knit community, somewhere my family's legacy could merge with new beginnings. So when I inherited my grandfather's old house in Sunrise Glen, I thought it was fate. Situated on the outskirts of a burgeoning suburban development, the house perched on a gentle slope, partially shaded by towering oaks. Age had left its marks. Moss clung to the stone foundation, lichen spread across wooden boards, and ivy draped corners. While some might see it as run down, I felt a certain reverence for the worn textures that whispered tales of the past. After finalizing inheritance paperwork, I visited Sunrise Glen for the first time in years. Time had changed the surroundings. Sleek new homes had sprung up, each sporting well-manicured lawns and matching mailboxes. The entire area was governed by a homeowners association, HOA, touting uniform standards. My grandfather's house, however, lay just at the boundary, technically under the HOA's rules, but historically a separate entity long before the association even existed. This gave me a unique status, still subject to some guidelines, yet with older property rights not fully standardized. I moved in, determined to preserve the house's charm. Sure, the exterior carried a greenish hue from moss, but I found it enchanting, especially the patches of lichen on the stone walls that had been there since my grandfather's day. I remembered him calling them living freckles. Little did I know that some neighbors, and one overbearing HOA enforcer, would see it differently. Within a week of moving in, I started noticing the strong presence of the HOA. At the top of the chain was Brenda Albright, though neighbors privately referred to her as Karen. She was in her mid-40s, always dressed in neat pastel blouses, hair cropped in a short, practical style. Karen brandished the HOA rulebook like a holy text, policing everything from fence height to the color of garden gnomes. My first interaction with her came unexpectedly on a mild Saturday morning. I was weeding along the front walkway, marveling at how the moss glistened after a recent drizzle. Suddenly, I heard a sharp clearing of a throat. Looking up, I spotted Karen standing on the sidewalk, arms folded. Her gaze flicked over the house's moss-coated siding. "Good morning," she said, forcing a polite tone. "You must be the new occupant of the old family home. I'm Brenda Albright, but folks around here call me Karen. I'm on the HOA board. We welcome new residents, but I hope you understand we have certain standards to uphold." I sensed an implied threat in her words. "Yes, I'm aware there's an HOA. My grandfather's property is under partial association rules, though, from what I recall." Karen pursed her lips. "Even so, we expect every house to maintain a certain aesthetic. That greenish growth on your exterior. Are you planning to power wash or repaint? It looks unsightly, I must say." I felt a surge of defensiveness. "It's not mold or decay, it's mostly moss and lichen. The structure is fine. Actually, it's part of the house's character." She raised an eyebrow. "Character or neglect? The association can issue notices if a home is deemed in disrepair." I forced a stiff smile. "Noted. I appreciate your concern. But as far as I'm aware, there's no actual damage. Just a historic surface." Karen gave a perfunctory nod and left, scribbling something on her ever-present clipboard. A pit formed in my stomach. I realized I might be in for a battle, defending my grandfather's legacy against an HOA hawk who valued uniform perfection. That evening, I rummaged through old documents and photos my grandfather had left behind. The house, built nearly a century ago, used local stone for its foundation and handcrafted wooden boards for the upper walls. The region's moist climate led to natural moss growth, giving the walls an otherworldly, fairy tale look. My grandfather used to host storytelling sessions on the porch, pointing out different moss patches that resembled mythical shapes. I discovered some older letters from a local historical society praising the house's architecture, an example of regional stone masonry rarely seen in modern developments. Another note indicated possible eligibility for heritage status, though it was never pursued. My grandfather, a modest man, hadn't wanted the fuss. Still, reading these notes sparked an idea. Perhaps I could leverage the house's historical significance if the HOA pressed me to clean up or repaint. Already, I sensed Karen might soon file a complaint. She seemed too fixated on the moss to let it go. If I could confirm the house's heritage value, maybe I'd have legal or cultural grounds to keep it as is. Sure enough, the official letter arrived within a week. Stamped with the HOA emblem, it read, "Notice of exterior maintenance concern. We have observed that your property's exterior walls display excessive moss, lichen, or organic matter that may undermine the neighborhood's visual standards. As per HOA guidelines, homeowners must maintain exteriors in a clean, well-kept manner. Action required. Please remove or clean the affected areas within 30 days to comply with our aesthetic rules. If not remedied, further action may follow." Signed, the board, on recommendation of Vice Chair, Ms. Albright. My anger flared, though it wasn't surprising. They considered my house excessive and unclean. I pictured Karen gloating over how official and unstoppable this letter seemed. But I refused to bow. The house had survived decades with that moss. If anything, it was part of the building's rustic beauty. I resolved to fight. First, I wrote a polite response, referencing the house's historical significance, stating I believed the mossy exterior was integral to its character, not a sign of neglect. I attached some of my grandfather's documents, but I suspected that might not sway the board. Karen's personal vendetta was likely deeper than a mere policy reading. Undeterred, I set out to see if the property could be formally recognized. I contacted the County Historical Preservation Office, explaining that my house might be a rare example of early 20th century stonemasonry. They were intrigued, requesting photos and records. Over the next weeks, I gathered data, snapping pictures of the moss-laden walls, detailing the materials, and scanning old architectural notes from my grandfather's archives. Simultaneously, I visited the local library, digging up references to the house's builder, a craftsman known for unusual methods. Some neighbors teased me, but I found a few enthusiastic, telling me they loved the house's storybook look. I discovered a handful of local history buffs who insisted the moss-laden stone was a hallmark of the region's older dwellings, praising the organic synergy. This spurred me on. The Preservation Office responded positively. They believed the house indeed had potential as a mini-heritage site, given its unique architecture and partial historical documentation. Achieving official status could protect it from mandatory aesthetic alterations if those changes contradicted its recognized heritage. The process wouldn't be instant, but it was feasible. This gave me hope that I could outmaneuver Karen's repaint or else directive. Meanwhile, Karen doubled down. She knocked on my door one afternoon, ironically complaining about how the mossy smell might bother neighbors. In truth, there was no such smell beyond a mild, earthy scent if you pressed your nose against the wall. She demanded a timeline for proper cleaning. I pointedly told her I was pursuing historical recognition, so the exterior would remain. Karen rolled her eyes. Historical or not, we have aesthetic standards. If you don't comply, the board could fine you daily. Her voice dripped with condescension. This is a nice community. We keep a pristine look. We can't have a moldy eyesore dragging down property values. I clenched my jaw. My house is not moldy or neglected. It's safe, structurally sound, and historically relevant. Are you so quick to discard local heritage for a uniform suburban facade? She gave a mocking laugh. Local heritage? That's a stretch. Look, dear, I'm trying to help. No one wants to see you penalized. But rules apply equally. With that, she left. My frustration soared, fueling my resolve to finalize the heritage process. Karen's arrogance ironically made me more determined to shield the house from her brand of uniform perfection. A monthly HOA board meeting loomed, and word spread that Karen intended to push a formal motion to demand I repaint or power wash. Expecting a confrontation, I gathered my documents and bravely attended. A decent crowd of residents came, curious about the drama. Karen, sitting near the front, kept glancing at me as if triumphant. The meeting eventually reached the agenda item labeled Exterior Compliance, number 14 Moss Growth Issue. Karen launched into a speech about how unsightly organic overgrowth tarnished the neighborhood's image. She displayed photos of my house from unflattering angles, emphasizing greenish patches. She claimed other neighbors had complained of a blight. Then she proposed a motion. I'd have 21 days to remove visible moss or face fines. My turn arrived. I stood, heart pounding, but determined. I explained that the moss-laden exterior was historically significant, referencing local stonemasonry traditions. I mentioned my ongoing application with the county's preservation office, stating that forcibly scrubbing or repainting might damage the original materials. A few board members looked uncertain. Karen had always run a tight ship, but now I was raising cultural and historical points. One or two asked if the moss was truly harming the structure. I answered no. A small handful of neighbors, presumably intrigued by the house's unique look, voiced mild support for me. Karen, exasperated, insisted the majority standard demanded a clean, uniform exterior. Eventually, the board postponed a final decision, wanting more info. Karen fumed at the delay, but I felt relief. Time was my ally, giving the preservation office more leeway to expedite my property's recognition. If I could secure official heritage status, the HOA couldn't force changes that undermined that status. Within a month, I got the call from the county's historical coordinator. After reviewing my documentation, they decided to provisionally list my house on the local heritage register. I needed to host an inspection so they could confirm authenticity. The next week, an official visited, marveling at the original stone foundation and the purposeful moss growth that signaled the house's age and craftsmanship. He took notes and photos, concluding it was indeed worthy of protective recognition. He also recommended we highlight it during the upcoming Heritage Week, a countywide event featuring tours of notable sites. I was elated. This was a game changer. If recognized, the HOA's demands would clash with state or county heritage guidelines that prioritized preserving original materials and appearance. The best part? The inspector said I could apply for a small grant to help maintain the structure in a historically sensitive manner, meaning no harsh power washing. Instead, experts would ensure any cleaning methods didn't strip away the building's character. I pictured Karen's reaction, anticipating her meltdown. She had no clue how her bullying had propelled me to take such an official route. Instead of cowering, I'd soon display a plaque stating that my Mossy home was an official piece of local heritage. As soon as the local heritage listing was made public, Karen stormed onto my porch. She brandished the HOA rulebook again, pointing at a clause about appearance consistent with the community. She sputtered that no county listing could override our local standards. Calmly, I presented the official county letter, explaining that forcibly removing the moss or repainting the stone would violate recognized heritage guidelines. She read it, face blanching. This is nonsense, she stammered. We can't have random exceptions left and right. Our neighborhood must remain uniform. I shrugged. You might see it that way, but the law sees a historically protected site. The county's stance is that the original exterior is integral to the building's identity. If you find me, I can appeal with this official recognition. Are you certain the HOA wants that legal fight? Karen trembled with fury. I almost felt a pang of pity, but then I recalled her threats and belittling remarks. She spun on her heel and left without a word. For the first time, I sensed I had the upper hand. Shortly after the listing, the county's historical coordinator invited me to participate in Heritage Week, a series of open houses, museum exhibits, and guided tours showcasing local landmarks. They suggested I open my property for short, scheduled tours, letting visitors appreciate the unique architecture, stonework, and yes, even the moss. In return, I could charge a small admission fee. The idea thrilled me. Not only would it highlight my family's legacy, but it might also endear the house to the wider community. I accepted, spending the next few weeks tidying the interior, but carefully leaving the moss outside untouched, creating brochures describing the house's background, and installing rope barriers to guide visitors safely around the yard. I also enlisted help from the Historical Society to provide docents who could discuss the stonemasonry techniques. Suddenly, I was transforming from an embattled homeowner into a caretaker of local heritage. The county's marketing flyer listed my house with an official event time, Historic Lichen House Tour, Sunday 2 to 5 p.m. Perfect. In the meantime, the HOA board convened again to review the newly minted heritage listing. Karen tried to rally them, claiming the moss degraded the neighborhood's uniform look. However, a couple of board members admitted they found the house charming and recognized the legal complexities of overriding a recognized site. They voted against imposing any fines or forced repaint. Karen was outvoted. Her face apparently turned beet red. A short official statement was released. The HOA respected the property's new status and hoped the homeowner would keep the yard otherwise tidy. A moderate victory for me. I guess from Karen's vantage, it was a humiliating defeat. Neighbors caught wind that the house was now part of Heritage Week. Some expressed curiosity. We had no idea it was so special. A few even apologized if they'd sided with Karen earlier. Word spread that I'd be offering paid tours on that Sunday. Admission a mere $5, with proceeds going partly to a local preservation fund. The hype built. Karen, of course, fumed. She tried a last-minute rumor that people would track mud through the neighborhood or that the tours might increase traffic. The county assured the HOA that the event was well managed. The board, lacking a real reason to forbid it, let it proceed. Karen stomped around, likely craving a new angle to sabotage me, but found none. Excitement swelled as I prepared for Heritage Week. I borrowed velvet ropes to mark a path around the exterior so visitors wouldn't accidentally trample the flower beds. The Historical Society lent me a foldable table for brochures. I printed color pamphlets with old photos of my grandfather, plus historical details. I also set up small placards describing each architectural quirk, like the hand-chiseled stones, the hammered copper fixtures, and of course, the distinctive moss growth. A local craft store donated vintage-inspired signage that read, "Welcome to Lichen's Tone House, EST 1923. That sign alone made me grin. I pictured Karen rolling her eyes at the name I'd coined, Lichen's Tone House, paying homage to the lichen and moss that vexed her so much. My final step was coordinating with the county's Heritage Week organizers. They expected a modest turnout, maybe 50 or so people, but I suspected curiosity might draw more. Sunday arrived bright and clear. I woke early, placing a few lawn chairs near the porch for docents, setting up a small snack station for volunteers. By noon, passers-by began trickling in. Some read the sign near the road. Historic Lichen's Tone House tours, 2 p.m. onward. A hush of anticipation built. At 2 p.m. sharp, a small queue formed by my gate. To my amazement, about a dozen people lined up, locals, families, even a few out-of-towners. I greeted them, collected the small fee, and started the first guided walk. The docents explained how the stone walls had aged gracefully, how the moss signified a well-preserved environment rather than neglect. Kids pointed at the shapes in the lichen, giggling when they spotted faces. Parents snapped photos. By mid-afternoon, more cars arrived. Word of mouth or local radio coverage must have spread. I ended up hosting multiple group tours, each about 20 minutes, weaving around the yard and onto the porch. Everyone marveled that such an unassuming structure could hold so much history. I overheard excited chatter. "It's so rustic and cool. I love the moss. It's like nature art." Some joked that their own homes were too bland in comparison. During the third tour, I noticed a familiar figure lurking at the back of the crowd. Karen. Arms folded. She wore a stern expression but seemed compelled to see what the fuss was about. She listened to the docent's spiel about local stone masonry, occasionally pursing her lips. When the group moved to the side yard, she gazed at the thick patches of moss that had ignited her condemnation. I wondered if she'd confront me or slip away quietly. As the tour ended, she lingered while the rest departed. I approached, bracing for an unpleasant conversation. She glanced at me, inhaling slowly. "Quite the spectacle you've made here," she said. "Turning your house into a sideshow." I forced a smile. "It's not a sideshow. People are learning about genuine local heritage. There's real interest in how older building methods have endured. The moss draws admiration, not scorn." Karen's jaw tightened. "I suppose there's a certain novelty. But I worry about the traffic, the disturbance to the neighborhood." I shrugged. "It's a single afternoon, sanctioned by the county. No law or HOA rule forbids it. So far, visitors have been respectful. This is precisely the outcome I intended, showcasing the home's unique character. Hardly any trouble." She fidgeted with her blouse cuff. "Well, I can't fine you for it, obviously." Then, more softly, "Maybe your house does have some historical charm, but it's still so out of place among the other neat exteriors." I appreciated the tiny concession in her words. "Different doesn't mean worthless, Karen. It can be a point of pride." She said nothing further, turning to walk away. For a fleeting moment, I sensed she might see the house's significance, but her ego wouldn't let her fully admit it. At least she didn't sabotage anything. That, in itself, was a relief. When the tours ended around 5 p.m., we'd hosted nearly 80 visitors, double the expected turnout. The docents were thrilled. I tallied the day's admission fees, after paying a small portion to the Preservation Society. Even after expenses, I pocketed a modest profit. More importantly, I'd proven the house's mossy exterior wasn't an eyesore, but a curiosity that enriched the community's cultural fabric. Word spread quickly on local social media. People posted selfies at Lichen house, praising the magical, mossy facade. Some older residents commented that they remembered hearing about the old stonemason who built it decades ago. My phone buzzed with messages from neighbors congratulating me on a successful event. The majority seemed impressed, or at least amused. Karen, however, was nowhere to be found. She likely scrolled through the pictures, stewing in annoyance. The final blow to her crusade came when local newspapers ran a short piece on Heritage Week's highlights, listing Lichen house as a hidden gem. A paragraph described the house as once considered an eyesore by some, but now cherished for its living tapestry of moss. The gentle dig at certain critics made me grin. In the days following, the HOA board quietly removed any mention of my moss issue from pending agendas. The official line was that the matter was resolved due to heritage considerations. Karen, obviously, had to swallow her pride. The board likely realized continuing the fight would look absurd after the house's widely publicized historical importance. Instead, they turned their attention to other mundane tasks, like installing new speed bumps or clarifying trash pickup times. One board member privately admitted that Karen's aggressive approach had tarnished the HOA's image. They wanted to avoid lawsuits or negative PR. The county's recognition of my house as a mini heritage site was a legal shield, preventing forced modernization. My success with Heritage Week proved that the old place, moss and all, had wide support, at least from the general public. Meanwhile, I got a letter from the county's Historical Society praising the well-run tours. They teased the possibility of future events or even an annual Lichen house open house. My mind whirled with possibilities. Maybe I'd do more to restore the interior to historical authenticity. Maybe I'd even run a small bed and breakfast. The bigger picture, the house's presence in the community was now assured. Karen's disapproval was powerless against official preservation status. Though publicly defeated, Karen wasn't entirely out of moves. She tried a petty maneuver, sending me a notice that my yard needed better edging and weed control, referencing a random HOA rule. The complaint seemed contrived. A quick glance at my yard showed no severe weed problem, so I recognized it as a last-ditch attempt to penalize me for not fitting in. I promptly complied with minimal fuss, hiring a landscaper to do a quick pass, thus neutralizing her tactic. She had no real grounds to escalate further. Occasionally, I'd spot her prowling the neighborhood with her clipboard, but her posture was less confident than before. Perhaps neighbors teased her about losing the Moss House war. She mostly avoided me. When we did cross paths, she offered curt nods, likely still seething inside that her aesthetic vision was overshadowed by cultural heritage and public interest. A neighbor jokingly said, "Who'd have guessed your moss-laden walls would become the local tourist attraction?" We shared a laugh. Indeed, the same patch of green growth that offended Karen's eyes had turned into a symbol of the area's storied roots, bringing a sense of pride and curiosity. The irony wasn't lost on me. Months rolled on, and the house continued to stand as a quietly beloved feature of Sunrise Glen. I installed a small plaque by the porch steps, Lichen house, recognized heritage site, which visitors sometimes snapped photos of. The moss thrived in the damp climate, continuing to give the stone an ever-changing tapestry of soft greens and grays. I learned to carefully prune any vines that threatened the stone's stability, but otherwise I let nature have its way. One weekend, an architecture professor from a nearby university asked if he could bring students to study the stonework and moss synergy. They found it fascinating how the environment and building merged. That day, Karen happened to drive by in her car, slowing down as she saw the group listening intently while I pointed out various features. She accelerated away, no doubt fuming that her campaign to clean up my property had backfired so spectacularly. With each new recognition or positive mention, the house's mystique grew. Locals sometimes called it the Moss House, or jokingly, the house Karen hates. But the negativity was overshadowed by curiosity and respect. It wasn't the largest or flashiest home, but it was truly unique in a sea of cookie-cutter developments. Perhaps the best outcome was seeing how the broader neighborhood reevaluated their stance on uniform aesthetics. A few other owners with older properties began celebrating their own quirks, like an original stone fence or an antique oak door. They realized the HOA shouldn't always force modern, sterile looks. Over time, the board introduced a new policy allowing for historical or distinctive features to remain if documented. Freed from the tyranny of absolute uniformity, residents could express individuality. Karen remained on the board, but her power waned. She begrudgingly signed off on these revised guidelines, lacking the support to oppose them. Some neighbors believed she might eventually learn to appreciate the diversity of architectural styles, but I wasn't holding my breath. Still, she no longer harassed me, likely accepting that her fight was a lost cause. As for me, I found a renewed sense of purpose. My original plan was just to quietly live in the inherited house, but the journey taught me how to stand up for heritage and personal choice. The joy of seeing visitors marvel at the moss-laden facade, and the delight of hearing children squeal that it looked like a fairy cottage, filled me with pride. My grandfather would have been proud that the living freckles on his beloved home became a highlight, not an eyesore. The story of how Karen tried to label my Mossy houses ugly, only for it to become a community treasure, remains local lore. People occasionally bring up the fiasco, referencing the Heritage Week tours that introduced them to the house's unusual charm. Now, whenever I step outside to admire the gentle sheen of green on the stones, I smile at the irony. The same moss Karen wanted to eradicate ended up captivating everyone else. Even a short documentary was filmed about the region's hidden architectural gems, featuring my house for a segment. Sometimes, kids pass by and ask if they can peek at the Moss Castle. I let them walk the path, telling them bits of the stonemason story. In a way, the tension that Karen ignited forced me to unearth the house's deeper narrative, forging a new bond with the community. Meanwhile, I keep the house well-maintained, just in a different sense, ensuring the natural growth is managed but never removed. The building stands as a quiet testament to how ugly can become beloved if given context. I do still see Karen around, though we rarely speak. If our eyes meet, I offer a polite nod, remembering how close she came to scrubbing away decades of history to enforce her bland uniformity. Now, forced to accept that her neighbor's Mossy home is a recognized heritage site, she can only watch as visitors occasionally drift by, snapping photos of the house she once maligned as dirty. Life moves on, and the moss keeps growing. And so, with each passing day, the old house stands strong, its living tapestry an emblem of resilience and culture. I learned that challenging the status quo requires patience and passion, and that sometimes the best way to thwart an overbearing HOA Karen is to prove that what she calls ugly is, in fact, a priceless piece of local identity.